The white city stood against the eastern sky like a fist of carved stone, each tier rising higher than the last, until the citadel crowned the summit in defiance of the encroaching dark. Minas Tirith had endured 1,000 years of siege and sorrow. But on this day, the 6th of March, in the year 3019 of the Third Age, its people moved with the jerking urgency of those who knew their time had run short. Smoke rose from the forges, hammers rang against iron. Women carried water up the narrow streets, while men hauled stones to reinforce the outer wall. Children no longer played in the fountains. The air tasted of ash and fear, and beneath it all lay the certainty that war was no longer coming. War had arrived. In the shadow of the second gate, where merchants once haggled over Lebethron wood and southern wine, a man stood alone. He was bald, utterly, completely bald, his scalp gleaming faintly in the gray morning light. His frame suggested neither warrior nor laborer, lean but unremarkable, the kind of build that would vanish in any crowd. He wore a garment of yellow fabric that covered him from neck to ankle, cinched at the waist with no apparent armor beneath. Red gloves extended past his wrists. Red boots rose to mid-calf. A white cloak hung from his shoulders, fastened with a simple clasp. No sword at his hip, no bow across his back, no spear in hand. The guards noticed him first, 2 men in the livery of the tower, their faces drawn tight with sleeplessness and dread. They approached with hands on hilts, their movements careful but not yet hostile. "You," the taller one said. His voice carried the flat authority of a man who had questioned too many strangers in too few days. "State your name and purpose." The bald man turned his head slowly, as if the question required consideration. His expression held no malice, no fear, no particular interest. Just a kind of distant acknowledgement, the way one might regard a persistent insect. "Saitama," he said. The name meant nothing to them. The guard's jaw tightened. "You're not of Gondor, not Rohan. Where do you come from?" "Somewhere else." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." The second guard, younger and visibly more nervous, gestured at Saitama's attire. "What manner of armor is that?" "What house do you serve?" "It's not armor, and I don't serve anyone." The words fell like stones into still water. In a city preparing for siege, in a realm defined by oaths and lineages and the long weight of duty, such a statement bordered on sedition. The taller guard's hand moved closer to his sword. "A wanderer in wartime is either a spy or a fool," he said. "Which are you?" Saitama scratched the back of his head, a gesture so casual it seemed to mock the tension coiling between them. "Neither, I guess. I'm just here." "No one is just here." The guard's voice hardened. "Mordor sends agents in many guises. You'll come with us until the steward decides what to do with you." Before either guard could move, a third presence made itself known. Not through sound or sudden motion, but through the simple weight of attention, the sensation of being observed by something older and more deliberate than ordinary sight. The guards turned. The crowd in the street seemed to still, though no one had commanded silence. An old man walked toward them, leaning on a staff taller than himself. His robes were gray and dusty from travel, his beard white as winter frost. Beneath the broad brim of his hat, his eyes held a clarity that suggested he saw not just the surface of things, but the shape of them. The bones beneath the skin, the current beneath the water. Gandalf the Grey had returned to Minas Tirith. He stopped a few paces from Saitama, studying him with an expression that gave away nothing. The guard stepped back without being told. Even in their exhaustion, even with war grinding against their gates, they knew better than to stand between a wizard and his curiosity. "You feel wrong," Gandalf said at last. Not an accusation. An observation spoken with the same neutral tone one might use to comment on the weather. Saitama met his gaze without flinching. "Yeah, I get that a lot. Do you know where you are?" "Some kind of fortress city. Lots of white stone. Everyone looks stressed. This is Minas Tirith, last great stronghold of men in the west. Beyond our borders lies Mordor, and from Mordor comes an army that means to break us utterly." Gandalf's voice remained calm, but something in it suggested the weight of ages pressing down. "In such times, the arrival of a stranger is never merely chance. So I will ask you plainly, what do you want?" The question hung in the air between them. Around them, the city continued its frantic preparations, hammers striking, voices calling the scrape of stone on stone. But in the small circle where the two men stood, a different kind of silence had taken root. Saitama considered the question with the same distant expression he'd given the guards. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no grand proclamation, no stirring declaration of purpose. "I got bored," he said. "And if people need help, I help." Gandalf's eyes narrowed slightly. Not in suspicion, but in the manner of one trying to read a language written in an unfamiliar script. "You speak as if boredom and heroism are the same thing." "They're not. But sometimes one leads to the other." Saitama shrugged. "I'm not looking for glory or treasure or any of that. If someone's in trouble and I can do something about it, I do. If not, I leave." "And you believe we are in trouble? You're building barricades and sharpening swords. Doesn't take a genius." For a long moment, Gandalf said nothing. His gaze remained fixed on Saitama, searching for something ambition, perhaps, or hidden malice, or the telltale signs of corruption that marked those who sought power for its own sake. He found none of these things. What he found instead was somehow more unsettling, a profound absence of desire, as if the man before him had stepped so far beyond ordinary human want that even the lure of dominion held no meaning. In all his long years, Gandalf had encountered many who claimed indifference to power. Most lied. Some believed their own lies. A precious few spoke truth. But this man, this bald stranger in his peculiar yellow garment, seemed to exist in a space beyond even truth or falsehood. He simply was in the way a stone was, or water, or the empty air. "You carry no weapon," Gandalf said quietly. "Don't need one. Every man who goes to war needs a weapon." "I'm not going to war. War's just happening around me." Saitama glanced past Gandalf toward the upper tiers of the city. "Look, I'm not here to cause problems. If you want me to leave, I'll leave. If you want me to help, I'll help. Either way, I'm not going to pretend I'm something I'm not." The guards exchanged uncertain glances. One opened his mouth to speak, but Gandalf raised a hand, silencing him without a word. "There are those in this city," the wizard said slowly, "who would see a man of your unusual nature as either a threat or a tool. They would seek to bind you with oaths or imprison you out of fear. I advise you to avoid giving them cause for either." "I don't do oaths," Saitama said flatly. "And if someone tries to lock me up, that's their problem, not mine." Despite everything, the siege, the darkness, the weight of the age pressing down, Gandalf felt the faintest pull at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "You are either the most dangerous man I have ever met, or the most harmless. I cannot yet tell which." "Does it matter?" "In war, everything matters." Before Saitama could respond, a sound rolled across the city like distant thunder. Not thunder, though the sky had darkened. Drums. War drums beating out a rhythm older than the stones of Minas Tirith, a cadence that spoke of fire and ruin and the breaking of the world. From the east, where the mountains of Mordor clawed at the horizon, a shadow deepened. Not the shadow of clouds, but something thicker, more deliberate, a darkness that moved with purpose and hunger. The drumbeat grew louder. Somewhere on the walls, a horn sounded, not in challenge, but in warning. Gandalf's expression hardened. He turned toward the citadel staff, gripped tight in one hand. "If you mean to help," he said without looking back, "you will have your chance soon enough. The storm is upon us." Saitama watched the wizard stride away, his gray robes billowing behind him like smoke. The guards remained uncertain whether to detain the stranger or follow their better instincts and let him be. In the end, they chose neither, backing away slowly, hands still near their weapons, eyes fixed on the bald man who stood unmoved by the approaching doom. Saitama tilted his head slightly, gazing toward the eastern sky. The darkness there had begun to boil, shot through with flickers of distant flame. He could feel it now, not with any magical sense, but with the simple recognition of one who had seen battle before. War was coming. Not the small conflicts he'd wandered through in his own world, but something larger, older, more absolute. He exhaled slowly, a sound lost beneath the rising drumbeat and the clatter of final preparations. "Here we go again," he muttered to no one in particular. High above on the 7th tier, where the white tree stood bare and lifeless, in its courtyard, another set of eyes had marked the stranger's arrival. Denethor, steward of Gondor, stood at a window overlooking his city, his hands clasped behind his back. He had seen Gandalf's return, had seen the wizard speak with an unknown man, had seen in the cut of that stranger's posture something that did not belong. The drums rolled on. The sky continued to darken. And in the hearts of Minas Tirith's defenders, hope and despair waged their own quiet war. Saitama remained where he was standing in the shadow of the gate, waiting for whatever came next, with the patience of someone who had learned long ago that battles began whether you were ready or not. The storm was indeed upon them, and beneath it all so faint that even Gandalf had barely sensed it, a crack ran across the music of the world, a discordant note threading through the ancient song. Something that should not exist had stepped into the pattern. The question now was whether it would harmonize or shatter everything. The answer would come soon enough. The Pelennor fields stretched before Minas Tirith like a vast killing floor. Flat and barren, save for scattered farmsteads now abandoned to ash and ruin. Dawn broke thin and gray over the plain, but the light brought no comfort. What it revealed instead was an ocean of darkness, rank upon rank of orcs, stretching to the horizon, their banners black against the pallid sky, their war cries rising like the howl of beasts that had never known mercy. Saitama stood on a low rise near the outer wall, hands in the pockets of his yellow garment, surveying the scene with the mild interest of someone watching rain clouds gather. Around him, the final preparations for battle reached their desperate crescendo. Archers lined the ramparts. Pike formations assembled in the shadow of the gate. Cavalry from Rohan, who had arrived in the night like thunder from the north, took position on the right flank, 6,000 riders whose horses stamped and snorted, sensing what their masters already knew. This would be a slaughter. A captain of Gondor approached Saitama, his armor dented from previous skirmishes, his face carved into lines of exhaustion that no single night's rest could ease. He'd been ordered to keep watch on the stranger, not to arrest him, not after Gandalf's intervention, but to ensure he didn't interfere. Or worse, flee when the real killing began. "You should get behind the walls," the captain said, his voice hoarse from shouting orders. "If you've no weapon and no armor, you'll be cut down in the first charge." Saitama didn't look at him. Probably not. Probably. The captain's hand tightened on his sword hilt. Do you understand what's coming? That's not an army out there. That's annihilation given form. I've seen armies before. Not like this. Saitama turned his head slightly, just enough to catch the captain's eye. His expression held no bravado, no warrior's fire. Just a quiet, almost bored certainty. Yeah, like this. The captain opened his mouth to argue, then thought better of it. There was something in the stranger's tone, not arrogance, but the flat statement of fact from someone who had learned truth through repetition. He'd seen this look before on the faces of veterans who had survived so many battles, that death had become merely another opponent, familiar and almost tedious. But this man was no veteran. He carried himself like someone who had wandered into a street brawl by accident and found it mildly annoying. A horn blast cut through the morning air, 3 sharp notes rising and falling. The signal for imminent contact. The Orc army surged forward. They came like a black tide, thousands upon thousands of twisted forms, moving in a grotesque mockery of order. Siege towers rolled among them, pushed by trolls whose muscles bunched like knotted rope beneath scarred hide. Drums thundered. War horns shrieked. The ground itself seemed to tremble beneath the weight of their advance. The Rohirrim charged to meet them. A spear of cavalry aimed at the heart of darkness, their battle cry ringing clear and bright across the plain. For a moment it seemed possible. For a moment, the sight of those horses in full gallop, of those spears, lowered in unison, carried the weight of legend. Then the armies collided, and legend drowned in blood. The Rohirrim carved deep into the Orc lines, their initial charge devastating. But the enemy was too numerous, too relentless. For every Orc that fell, 3 more pressed forward. The cavalry began to slow, to fragment horses stumbling over corpses, riders dragged down into the churning mass of blades and claws. On the left flank, a company of Gondor's infantry found itself surrounded. Saitama watched as their formation buckled, as Orcs poured through the gap like water through a shattered dam. Men screamed, fell, died with their hands still reaching for weapons they'd never lift again. The captain beside Saitama swore viciously, already turning to rally reinforcements. He made it 3 steps before he stopped, frozen by what he saw. The bald stranger had started walking. Not running, not charging, just walking, hands still in his pockets, moving toward the surrounded infantry, with the unhurried gait of someone taking a morning stroll. "What are you doing?" the captain shouted. "You'll be killed." Saitama didn't answer, didn't even glance back. He simply continued forward, stepping over the churned earth, passing the outer stakes, entering the killing ground with the same expression he'd worn since arriving, mildly attentive, faintly bored, utterly unconcerned. An Orc spotted him first. A massive creature, nearly 7 feet tall, wielding a cleaver-like blade still dripping with Gondorian blood. It turned toward this lone figure in yellow and white lips peeling back from jagged teeth in what might have been a grin or a snarl. It charged. Saitama stopped walking, pulled one hand from his pocket, formed a fist, and punched. The Orc didn't explode, didn't shatter into fragments. It simply ceased to exist in that space, replaced by a concussive wave that tore through the battlefield like the breath of an angry god. The air itself seemed to buckle. The ground rippled. Every Orc within 30 yards flew backward as if struck by an invisible hammer, their bodies tumbling end over end before crashing down in broken heaps. Where the Orc formation had stood, there was now a corridor. a perfectly clear path cutting through the army wide enough for 3 men to walk abreast, stretching nearly 100 yards before the shockwave finally dispersed. Silence fell across that section of the battlefield. Not the silence of peace, but of stunned incomprehension, the moment when the mind struggles to process what the eyes have witnessed. Saitama lowered his fist, scratched his head, looked at the surrounded Gondorian soldiers who now stood unharmed in the space his single strike had cleared. "You should probably get back to your lines," he said. The soldiers stared at him. One dropped his sword. Another fell to his knees, though whether in gratitude or shock was impossible to say. Their sergeant, a grizzled man with gray in his beard and a fresh cut across his cheek, managed to find his voice. What are you? Just a guy." Saitama turned, surveying the battlefield. The Orcs had recovered from their shock. They were already reforming, filling the gap, adapting with the mindless persistence of creatures bred for nothing but war. "You should move. This is going to get messier." The sergeant didn't argue. He barked orders, and his men scrambled toward the relative safety of the walls, casting backward glances at the bald stranger who had somehow carved reality itself into a new shape. Saitama watched them go, then sighed. The Orcs were coming again. Thousands of them, their initial hesitation burned away by fury and the driving will of their distant master. They surged forward in a black wave, eager to drown this anomaly in sheer numbers. He pulled his other hand from his pocket. What followed was not a battle. Battles required 2 sides, capable of inflicting harm on each other. What happened on the Pelennor fields, in the moments after Saitama engaged, was closer to a natural disaster wearing human skin. He moved through the Orc ranks like wind through grass. Each punch created zones of devastation, not explosions, but areas where matter simply relocated itself violently. Bodies flew, weapons shattered mid-swing, the ground cracked and buckled. He didn't fight with technique or strategy. He simply existed in spaces where enemies had been, and those enemies ceased to be a problem. From the walls of Minas Tirith, thousands watched in silence. Some cheered. Some prayed. Others simply stood frozen, trying to reconcile what they witnessed with everything they understood about the nature of war and mortality. Gandalf stood among them on the battlements, leaning on his staff, his expression unreadable. Beside him, Aragorn, newly revealed as the heir of Isildur, watched with the careful attention of a man who understood that not all power served the same master. "He fights without joy," Aragorn said quietly. "Without rage, as if it means nothing to him." "Because it does mean nothing," Gandalf replied. He said as much. "For him, this is merely something that needs doing." Can we trust such a man? Can we afford not to? Gandalf's eyes never left the battlefield. He could have ended this by now. Carved a path straight to the Black Gate if he chose. But he doesn't. He clears space for our soldiers, breaks their formations, gives us room to breathe. He does exactly what he said he would help, but not replace. Aragorn's jaw tightened. And when the war ends, what then? Then we discover whether a man who can break armies is also wise enough to leave kingdoms intact. On the field below, Saitama had stopped advancing. He stood in the middle of a circle of devastation, surrounded by groaning bodies and shattered weapons, looking almost disappointed. The Orc army had begun to pull back, not in organized retreat, but in the instinctive recoil of predators confronted by something they couldn't categorize as prey. A Rohirrim rider galloped past him, spear raised in salute. Saitama didn't acknowledge it. He was staring toward the east, where the sky had grown darker still, where something vast and terrible was beginning to stir. The captain from earlier approached on foot, limping slightly, his armor scorched. He stopped a respectful distance away, as if unsure whether to treat Saitama as ally or elemental force. "We're pushing them back," the captain said, his voice thick with something between awe and fear. "Because of you. You turned the tide." Saitama glanced at him, then back at the battlefield. Bodies littered the ground in all directions, orc and human both, though far more of the former. Men moved among the fallen, searching for the living, granting mercy to those beyond saving. "I didn't turn anything," Saitama said quietly. "I just made a path. They still had to walk it. But without you, without me, they would have fought anyway. Some would have died. Some would have lived. That's how war works." He started walking back toward the city, hands returning to his pockets. "I just made the numbers a little less terrible." The captain watched him go, wanting to argue, to explain that thousands of lives had been preserved by those devastating punches. But something in the stranger's posture stopped him. There was no satisfaction there, no pride in victory, just the same flat acceptance, as if saving an army carried the same weight as sweeping a floor. As Saitama passed through the gates, soldiers parted to let him through. Some reached out as if to touch him, to confirm he was real. Others simply stared their faces, carrying the peculiar expression of men who had witnessed a miracle and found it somehow disturbing. He didn't stop, didn't acknowledge the attention. He walked through the streets of Minas Tirith until he found a quiet corner near a fountain that had run dry. There he sat down on the stone rim, tilted his head back against the wall, and closed his eyes. Around him, the city celebrated its survival. Wine flowed. Voices rose in song. The Pelennor had been held. The great host of Mordor had been broken, not destroyed, but driven back. Their momentum shattered. Victory tasted sweet to those who drank it, but in the quiet spaces between the celebrations in the homes, where women wept for husbands who would not return in the field hospitals, where the wounded screamed and bled and begged for endings, a different truth persisted. Saitama heard it in the silence that surrounded the noise, saw it in the way even those who cheered kept glancing toward the east, where Mordor's smoke still rose, where the eye of Sauron burned on in eternal malice. Power could break an army, could carve corridors through death itself, could turn tides and save thousands. But it couldn't bring back the dead, couldn't heal the wounds that would never close, couldn't erase the fact that tomorrow or the day after the war would continue and more would fall. He opened his eyes, staring at nothing in particular. "Late again," he murmured. Somewhere in the upper tiers, Gandalf stood alone, gazing toward the darkening sky. He had felt it during the battle, a shift in the air, a wrongness that went deeper than Sauron's malice or Mordor's shadow. The stranger's power had torn something, nothing visible, nothing most would notice. But the music had felt it. And now in the east, something ancient stirred in response, something that had been sleeping, waiting for the world to break just enough to permit its return. The wizard's grip tightened on his staff. The battle was won. But the war had just become infinitely more complicated. Night fell over Minas Tirith. The victory fires burned bright, and in the darkness beyond the walls where the orcs regrouped and licked their wounds, the drums began again, slower now, deeper, carrying a rhythm that spoke of patience and inevitable return. Saitama remained by the fountain, unmoving, listening to a war that would not end simply because he could punch through it. Somewhere in the distance carried on wind that tasted of ash. In iron came the first faint shriek of a Nazgul. The real test was still coming. The cold came first. Not the clean cold of winter wind or mountain snow, but something deeper, a chill that seeped into bone and spirit alike that made breath catch and heart stutter. It rolled across the Pelennor like fog, though the sky remained clear. Men who had fought through the morning without flinching now found their hands trembling on their weapons. From the east, a shadow descended. The Witch King of Angmar rode at the head of his remaining Nazgul, mounted on a creature that was neither bird nor dragon, but something birthed in darkness and fed on carrion. Its wings stretched wide enough to cast entire companies into shadow. Its cry split the air like tearing metal, a sound that reached past the ears and clawed directly at the seat of courage. Soldiers broke. Not all, but enough. Men who had held their ground against orc charges now turned and ran their weapons clattering to the stones. Others simply sank to their knees, weeping, overcome by a despair that had no rational source. The Witch King surveyed the battlefield from above his presence, a wound in the world. Where his gaze fell, hope withered. No face was visible beneath his crown and helm, only darkness, ancient and patient, and utterly devoid of mercy. He had come to break the last resistance of men, to shatter their king, to prove that no mortal power could stand before the servants of Sauron. His fell beast descended toward the gates, where the defenders had begun to scatter like leaves before a storm. Saitama stood in the creature's path. He hadn't moved from his position near the outer wall, while others fled, while captains shouted orders that no one could hear over the Nazgul's shriek. He simply watched the approaching shadow with the same neutral expression he'd worn since arriving. The Witch King noticed him. How could he not? This bald figure in yellow standing alone, while armies dissolved around him, radiating not defiance, but simple presence, the way a stone might sit unmoved in a river's current. The fell beast landed with enough force to crack paving stones, its talons gouging furrows in the earth. The Witch King dismounted in a rustle of black robes and ancient mail. He stood a full head taller than any man, his form wrapped in power that had endured for thousands of years. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of graves and forgotten kingdoms. Mortal. The word dripped contempt. You stand before your ending. Kneel, and your death may come swift. Saitama tilted his head slightly. Yeah, I'm good standing. For a moment, nothing moved. The Witch King seemed to process this response, searching it for hidden meaning, for the courage or foolishness that would drive a lone man to face him without trembling. He found neither. What he found instead was absence, a void where fear should live, where the ancient terror he wielded should have taken root and flowered into madness. This man felt nothing. Not because he was brave, but because the Witch King's power simply had nowhere to grip. The realization brought something close to anger. The Witch King raised his mace, a weapon that had crushed the skulls of kings, that carried in its iron head the condensed malice of ages. He brought it down in an arc designed to shatter bone and will simultaneously. Saitama caught it, not with a block or a parry. He simply reached up almost lazily and closed his hand around the mace's head mid-swing. Metal groaned. The Witch King pulled, applying strength that could have toppled towers. The weapon didn't move. Saitama looked at the mace, then at the Witch King. His expression suggested mild curiosity, the way one might examine an unfamiliar insect. "This supposed to hurt?" he asked. The Witch King wrenched backward, abandoning the mace. His hand went to the sword at his side, a blade forged in sorcery, designed to wound not just flesh, but the spirit itself. He drew it in a single fluid motion, the metal singing a note of pure hatred as it cleared the scabbard. He struck. The blade should have pierced Saitama's chest, should have carved through whatever strange armor he wore, should have found the quick of him and filled it with frost and despair. It shattered. Not against armor, not against any visible defense. The sword simply met Saitama's chest and broke fragments of ancient steel, scattering across the stones like scattered rain. The Witch King stared at the hilt in his hand. In 3,000 years, his blade had never failed, never dulled, never met anything it couldn't cut. Saitama brushed a piece of broken sword from his shoulder. "You done?" What happened next occurred too quickly for most observers to follow. The Witch King lunged forward, hands reaching to grasp, to drain life force, directly to employ powers that required no weapon, only contact and will. Saitama punched him. Not with full force, not with the devastating power he'd unleashed on the Orc army. Just a quick jab, almost dismissive, the kind of strike one might use to shoo away an annoyance. The Witch King's armor caved inward. His form, held together by sorcery and the will of his master, buckled. He flew backward, tumbling through the air before crashing into a siege tower 200 yards distant. The tower swayed, groaned, and collapsed in a thunder of splintering wood. Silence fell across the battlefield. The Witch King rose from the wreckage. His armor was dented, his robes torn, but the essence of him remained ancient, terrible, bound by powers deeper than steel or flesh. He had been diminished, but not destroyed. His form already beginning to reconstitute, to draw upon reserves of malice that had sustained him through millennia, but he did not advance. For the first time in an age beyond counting, the Lord of the Nazgul hesitated. Behind Saitama, figures emerged from the city gates. A woman in armor, her helm removed to reveal golden hair, and a face set with determination that bordered on fury. A small figure beside her, too small to be a man. A hobbit gripping a blade and trembling, but holding his ground. Éowyn of Rohan and Merry Brandybuck had come to fulfill a prophecy older than either of them understood. Saitama glanced back, registered their presence, and stepped aside. "You two got something to say to this guy?" he asked. Éowyn's eyes widened. She had expected to die here, had come prepared for it. But the Witch King, the unkillable terror who had broken her uncle's mind, stood battered. His attention divided between this impossible bald stranger and the woman who had dared to take the field. The Witch King's gaze settled on Éowyn. Recognition flickered in that empty hood. "You fool! No man can kill me. Die now." Éowyn removed her helmet entirely, let it fall. Her voice rang clear and cold across the stones. "I am no man." She struck. Merry struck with her, his small blade finding the gap behind the Witch King's knee. A blade forged specifically to harm such creatures carried unknowing until this moment demanded it. The Witch King screamed, not in pain but in the sudden understanding that the world had betrayed him. That prophecy and destiny and the careful weaving of ages had converged in this instant, to unmake what should have been eternal. Éowyn's sword found his crown, found the void beneath it, found the ancient will that had refused death for 3,000 years and severed it at last. The Witch King of Angmar fell. His robes collapsed inward. His armor clattered empty to the stones. A shriek rose from the wreckage, not of voice, but of essence, unmaking itself, and then faded into silence more complete than any death. Éowyn stood over the remains, breathing hard, her sword still raised. Merry sat on the ground nearby, clutching his arm, where the Witch King's power had burned him even in dissolution. Saitama walked over to the scattered armor, nudged it with his foot. He's really gone? Gandalf appeared beside him, materializing from the chaos of battle with the silent efficiency of one who had walked these fields before. The wizard's face was grim, but something like satisfaction flickered in his eyes. You broke his form, Gandalf said quietly, but you did not unmake him. That required something else, something you could not provide. Man, the prophecy thing, destiny, choice, the courage of those who should have no chance. Gandalf looked at Éowyn and Merry. You gave them the opening, but they struck the blow that mattered. Remember that distinction. Saitama shrugged. I just moved him out of the way. They did the rest. Precisely. Gandalf's tone carried approval but also warning. Your strength can shatter armies, can break even creatures of ancient power. But some victories require more than force. They require sacrifice. They require those who act knowing they will fall, choosing to act regardless. Sounds complicated? It is the only thing that has ever truly defeated evil in this world. Around them, the battle continued to rage. The Witch King's fall had sent ripples through the enemy ranks, confusion, disarray, the sudden absence of the will that had driven them forward. The Rohirrim pressed their advantage. Gondor's soldiers rallied. But the cost was already visible. Bodies littered the field. The walls bore scars that would never fully heal. Families had been shattered, futures erased. Saitama looked across the Pelennor, his expression unreadable. This happened a lot here. Big prophecies and people dying to fulfill them. More often than I would wish, Gandalf replied, though rarely so cleanly as this. Doesn't seem clean to me. No, the wizard's voice softened. It never is. Éowyn approached her steps unsteady, but her spine straight. She looked at Saitama with an expression that mixed gratitude and unease, the look of someone whose moment of defining courage had been made possible by forces she couldn't begin to understand. Thank you, she said. Without you, you would have found another way, Saitama interrupted. Or you would have died trying. Either way, I didn't make your choice for you. She blinked. That's not. He's right, Gandalf said gently. The courage was yours. The blade was yours. The victory belongs to you and the brave hobbit who stood with you. This stranger merely ensured you lived long enough to claim it. Merry struggled to his feet, cradling his burned arm. But the Witch King, he broke him like pottery, Saitama finished. Yeah, but pottery can be glued back together. What you two did was different. You ended him. There's a difference. Mersruni stared at him, trying to process this philosophy from a man who had just punched an immortal terror through a siege tower. Before anyone could respond, a horn blast echoed from the city. 3 short notes. The signal for council for command gathering in the aftermath of battle. Gandalf turned toward Minas Tirith, his expression growing distant. The war is not finished. Sauron will have felt this loss, and he will adapt. What's next? Saitama asked. That depends on what those wiser than I decide. Gandalf began walking toward the gates, then paused. But I suspect you will be part of those discussions whether you wish to be or not. Power such as yours cannot go unaddressed in a world at war. Saitama watched the wizard go, looked down at the scattered remnants of the Witch King's armor, felt the cold slowly lifting from the air though the sky remained dark. Éowyn stood beside him in silence, both of them staring at the evidence of what had been unmade. "You're not from here," she said finally. "Not a question." "No." "Where then?" "Somewhere else. Doesn't really matter." "It matters to me. I need to understand what you are." Saitama turned to face her fully. His expression remained neutral, but something in it suggested a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "I'm just someone who got strong. Strong enough that normal fights don't mean anything anymore. Strong enough that I could end this whole war right now if I wanted." "Then why don't you?" "Because it wouldn't stick. Someone explained that to me. Said if I do everything, take away all the hard choices, then I'm not helping. I'm just making everyone weaker." He started walking toward the city. "So I punch the things that need punching and let everyone else do the rest." Éowyn watched him go, this strange warrior who spoke like a philosopher and fought like a force of nature. She wanted to argue, to insist that such power carried responsibility, that he could save so many if he simply chose to act. But something in his departing figure stopped her. A loneliness that armor and weapons couldn't touch. The isolation of someone who had climbed so far beyond ordinary struggle that even victory had lost its taste. She turned back to the battlefield, to the soldiers tending wounded, to the grim work of counting the dead. The Witch King was gone. A victory, yes, but the war ground on. And somewhere in the east, in the darkness of Mordor, an eye burned with rage at this latest setback. The drums would beat again, the armies would march. And all the strength in the world couldn't change the fact that some things had to be chosen, not conquered. Night fell. The pyres were lit for the fallen. And in the council chambers of Minas Tirith, plans began to form for a gambit more desperate than any before. Saitama sat alone in a quiet corner, listening to the morning songs drift through the stone streets, wondering if there would ever come a fight that actually mattered again. The answer was coming, sooner than anyone expected. And it would cost more than any of them were prepared to pay. The council chamber sat high in the citadel, a circular room whose windows offered views of the Pelennors' smoking ruin. Dawn light filtered through gaps in the storm clouds, pale and uncertain. Around the table sat those who bore the weight of command. Aragorn revealed now as Isildur's heir, his face carved with the exhaustion of kingship not yet claimed. Gandalf, his gray robes dust-stained, leaning heavily on his staff. Éowyn present despite protocol, her arm bandaged where the Witch King's malice had burned. Several captains of Gondor, grim-faced men who had watched their soldiers die by the hundreds. And Saitama, seated near the window, looking distinctly uncomfortable with the formal proceedings. Aragorn spoke first, his voice carrying the measured authority of one born to lead but long denied the chance. "The enemy has suffered losses. The Witch King's destruction will ripple through their ranks. But Sauron's host remains vast. If we hold here waiting, he will grind us down through sheer numbers." "Then we do not wait," one of the captains said, a veteran with a scar bisecting his left cheek. "We strike. March on the Black Gate itself. Force him to meet us in open battle." "Suicide," another captain countered. "Even with." He gestured vaguely toward Saitama. "Whatever aid we've been granted, we cannot match Mordor's full might." Gandalf's eyes remained closed, his breathing slow and deliberate. When he finally spoke, his words fell like stones into still water. "The question is not whether we can win such a battle. We cannot. The question is whether we can draw Sauron's gaze long enough for another gambit to succeed." All eyes turned to him. Frodo Baggins carries the One Ring toward Mount Doom. Gandalf continued. If he succeeds, if he can destroy it in the fires where it was forged, Sauron falls regardless of how many soldiers he commands. Our task is not victory. It is distraction. Silence filled the chamber. The captains exchanged glances that mixed hope with the sick understanding of what the wizard proposed. A diversion. A sacrifice. March the remnants of their armies to Mordor's front door and die loudly enough that the Eye looked away from two hobbits crawling through the ash. How long? Aragorn asked quietly. Days. Perhaps only hours if fortune abandons us. And if this Frodo fails, then we lose regardless of what we do here. Saitama shifted in his chair, the movement drawing attention. He'd been silent through the entire discussion, content to observe. Now, with everyone's focus turning his direction, he spoke with the blunt directness that seemed to define him. Why don't I just carry them there? Pick them up, jump to the volcano, drop them off. Done in 5 minutes. The suggestion hung in the air like something obscene. Several captains looked genuinely offended, as if he'd proposed burning the White Tree for kindling. Gandalf's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this question. Because the ring does not simply corrupt through proximity. It corrupts through temptation, through the slow erosion of will. Every step Frodo takes toward Mount Doom is a test of his resolve. Every moment he chooses to continue despite the weight crushing him is a victory over the ring's influence. So it's about the journey, Saitama said flatly. It is about the choice. If you carry him to the mountain, you rob him of his agency. You make the burden easier, yes, but you also make the choice less meaningful. And the ring, Gandalf leaned forward slightly, is not a simple object. It is a vessel of will. Sauron's will condensed and given form. If Frodo does not earn his path to its destruction, if he does not pay the price in suffering and doubt, and near breaking, then the ring will find another way to survive. Saitama frowned. That doesn't make sense. Doesn't make. An object's an object. Not here. Gandalf's voice hardened. Here will and matter intertwine. Here destiny and choice dance together in ways your world perhaps does not know. The ring must be resisted, not simply transported. Its bearer must prove stronger than its corruption moment by moment until the final moment when he casts it down. Skip that journey and you hand victory to Sauron through a different door. Seems like a rigged game. All great conflicts are rigged, Aragorn interjected. His tone carried no bitterness, only tired acceptance. The question is whether we play our part well enough to tip the scales. Saitama studied them both, the wizard and the would-be king, trying to reconcile their logic with anything resembling sense. In his experience, problems had solutions. You identified the obstacle, you removed it, you moved on. This world seemed determined to complicate simple mechanics with philosophy and prophecy. But he'd seen the aftermath of the Pelennor, had stood among soldiers who wept for brothers in arms gone forever, had understood at least partially that some costs couldn't be punched away. Fine, he said, but there's still the question of what I do while you're marching to your deaths. You do exactly what you've done thus far, Gandalf replied. You create openings. You shatter their formations when they threaten to overwhelm us. You ensure our soldiers have room to fight. But you do not win the battle for us. You do not break through to Barad-dûr and tear down Sauron's tower with your hands. Why not, if I can? because you can do more than that." Gandalf's interruption was sharp, urgent. "And that is the danger. You are a force from beyond this world's framework. Your strength does not answer to the rules that govern Arda. If you unleash your full capability, if you attempt to simply erase Sauron through overwhelming power, you will tear something. A piece of the music. A strand of the weaving that holds reality coherent." Saitama's frown deepened. "You keep mentioning this music thing. What is it?" "The foundation of existence here. The song from which all matter and spirit arose. It has rules, harmonies. When those are violated, severely enough consequences emerge." Gandalf's gaze held weight beyond his years. "There are entities older than Sauron, older than this age, and the ages before. They sleep in the deep places, in the spaces between notes. They wait for tears in the fabric, for gaps through which they might return. Your power used without restraint could wake them. And they'd be worse than Sauron. Sauron wishes to dominate, to rule. These others wish only to unmake, to return everything to the void from which it first emerged." The wizard's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "So yes, worse." The room had gone completely still. Even the captains, who understood little of wizardly talk, grasped the essential truth the stranger among them carried a button. He must not press a weapon. He must not fully deploy, or the cure would prove more devastating than the disease. Saitama absorbed this, his face betraying nothing. After a long moment, he shrugged. "So I hold back. Clear paths. Punch things that need punching, but not too hard. That about it?" "That is precisely it," Gandalf confirmed. "And if something goes wrong, if your hobbit gets caught or Sauron figures out the plan, then we adapt. But under no circumstances do you attempt to solve the problem by obliterating Mordor from the map. The cost would be too high." Saitama nodded slowly. "All right. Your world, your rules. I'll play along." Aragorn stood, his hand resting on the pommel of his reforged blade. "Then we march in 2 days. Give the wounded time to stabilize the soldiers, time to rest. We'll take everyone who can hold a weapon to the Black Gate. Make enough noise that Sauron cannot ignore us." "How many will return?" one of the captains asked quietly. "Few," Aragorn said. "Perhaps none. But we do not march for victory. We march so others may achieve it on our behalf." The meeting dissolved after that, captains departing to organize the impossible logistics of a suicide mission. Éowyn lingered, her eyes fixed on Saitama with an intensity that bordered on accusation. "You could save them," she said when they were alone. "All of them. You could end this war in an hour if you chose." "Yeah," Saitama agreed. "Probably." "Then why?" "Because I'd break something fixing it, apparently." He moved toward the window, gazing out at the smoldering fields. "I've been strong for a long time. Strong enough that most problems just stop being problems when I show up. But here being strong isn't enough. Being willing to use that strength makes things worse, not better." "I don't understand." "Neither do I, really." His voice carried a weariness that transcended the physical. "But I've learned to recognize when I'm out of my depth. This isn't about punching anymore. It's about something else. Something I can help with, but can't solve." Éowyn studied his profile, this enigma who spoke of earth-shattering power with the casual disinterest of someone discussing the weather. "Do you even care about any of this?" He considered the question seriously. "I care about people not dying when I can prevent it, I care about not making things worse. Beyond that, he shrugged. I stopped caring about most things a long time ago. When you can solve any problem by hitting it hard enough, problems stop feeling real. They're just obstacles, temporary annoyances. That sounds lonely. It is. The admission came without self-pity, without any request for sympathy. Just a statement of fact delivered with the same flat affect he applied to everything. Eowyn found herself pitying him despite his power. Or perhaps because of it. To stand so far above all struggle that even saving kingdoms felt routine. To possess strength sufficient to reshape the world, yet find no satisfaction in its use. What kind of existence was that? When this is over, she said carefully, will you stay or return to wherever you came from? Haven't decided. Depends on whether I'm still bored. And if you're not, if you find purpose here, Saitama turned to face her fully. His eyes held a depth that his simple speech patterns often concealed. Purpose isn't something you find in my experience. It's something you had once and lost or never had at all. I became strong because I wanted to be a hero. Wanted to save people and fight bad guys and make a difference. Then I got so strong that none of it mattered anymore. No challenge. No struggle. Just existing until the next thing that needs hitting shows up. Then why continue? Why help at all? Because what else am I going to do? The question hung between them unanswerable and utterly sincere. Eowyn had no response. What did you say to someone whose power had rendered their own existence meaningless? Gandalf reappeared in the doorway, his expression grave. We have reports. Frodo and Sam have entered Mordor. They crossed the border near Cirith Ungol 2 days ago. Then the clock starts, Saitama said. Yes. We march at dawn in 2 days. The Black Gate awaits. The wizard departed again, leaving Saitama and Eowyn alone with the weight of what was coming. Outside, the city continued its preparations. Forges rang, quartermasters shouted, horses were shod, weapons sharpened. All the mundane machinery of war ground forward, oblivious to the existential questions plaguing those at the top. Saitama remained at the window, staring toward the east, where Mordor's shadow stained the horizon. Somewhere beyond that darkness, 2 small figures crawled through ash and despair, carrying a burden no army could lift. And behind it all, an eye burned patient and malevolent, counting down the hours, until it could crush the last resistance of the free peoples and claim dominion over all that remained. The war had entered its final phase, and the strongest man in Middle-earth could do nothing but watch and wait and hope his restraint wouldn't cost too many lives. 2 days until the Black Gate. 2 days until they learned whether sacrifice and slim hope could outweigh the crushing weight of overwhelming power. The answer waited in fire and shadow. And no amount of strength could guarantee which way the scales would tip. Mordor did not welcome intruders. It devoured them. The land itself seemed to reject life, a vast waste of ash and stone where nothing grew, except the twisted fortifications of Sauron's malice. The air tasted of sulfur and burning metal. The sky hung low and oppressive, a permanent twilight of smoke and chemical fog that turned day into perpetual dusk. Through this desolation, 2 figures crawled. Frodo Baggins and Samwise Gamgee, reduced by hunger and thirst to barely more than shadows, themselves moved with the painful slowness of those who had reached the absolute limit of endurance and discovered there was still further to go. The ring hung against Frodo's chest, a weight that had nothing to do with physical mass. It pressed on his mind, his will, his very sense of self. With every step toward Mount Doom, its voice grew louder, not words exactly, but promises, offers of power. Visions of what could be if he simply claimed it, if he stopped resisting and accepted the gift being offered. He did not speak of this to Sam. Could not. The burden was his alone to carry. Behind them, at a carefully maintained distance, Saitama moved through the wasteland with the same unhurried pace he brought to everything. He'd left the main force at the border. Aragorn had led the army toward the Black Gate, while Gandalf nodded silent approval for Saitama to shadow the true mission. "Stay at the edges," the wizard had instructed. "Clear their path when obstacles arise. But do not approach them directly. The ring will sense you, and what it cannot tempt it will seek to destroy through other means." So Saitama kept to the ridgelines and the deep shadows of ruined fortifications, always within range, to intervene if disaster struck, never close enough to interfere with their crawling progress. He dealt with monsters, with armies, with beings of ancient power. But he'd never felt anything quite like the presence that emanated from that small golden band around Frodo's neck. It wasn't physical, wasn't tangible in any conventional sense. But it pressed against reality like a thumbprint in wet clay, warping the space around it, making the air itself feel wrong. And when his attention drifted toward it, when he tried to observe Frodo directly, the ring seemed to notice. It did not reach for him, did not attempt the seduction it used on lesser beings. It recoiled. Like a predator encountering something that defied categorization, the ring pulled back from Saitama's presence, drawing tight around itself, its constant whisper of temptation, falling silent in his proximity. Not fear precisely, but something close. Recognition that he existed outside the framework of desire and ambition it relied upon to function. This created an unexpected consequence. In the dark tower of Barad-dûr, in the chamber where the eye burned, eternal, Sauron felt the disturbance, felt his precious creation flinch from something it could not comprehend. The sensation was so alien, so unprecedented, that for several long seconds, the Dark Lord's attention wavered from the broader strategic picture. What was this anomaly? This void in the pattern where temptation went to die? The eye shifted, turned, began to search. And in that moment of distraction, far below in the volcanic wastes, an orc patrol that should have spotted two hobbits moving through an exposed stretch of ash marched past them instead, following orders to investigate the strange presence their distant master had suddenly fixated upon. Sam noticed first. He'd been preparing to pull Frodo into a crevice to hide while the patrol passed. But they simply kept going. 50 yards to the south, marching with purpose toward the mountain ridges, never once glancing in their direction. "Mr. Frodo," Sam whispered. "Did you see?" "I saw." Frodo's voice was a rasp, barely human. "We need to move. Now, while they're gone." They crawled forward, covering ground that should have been impossible to traverse without discovery. Sam didn't question it. Didn't dare. In a land where every moment brought some new horror, a moment of inexplicable fortune was too precious to examine closely. But Frodo felt it. Felt the ring's confusion, its sudden uncertainty. Something had entered Mordor that it could not account for, could not categorize, and the presence terrified it in ways no mortal resistance ever had. Miles away, Saitama crouched on an outcrop of volcanic stone, observing the Orc patrol's passage. They'd come within a dozen yards of him before veering off, responding to commands screamed from distant overseers. Whatever Sauron was looking for, he hadn't found it yet. Good. Let the eye chase shadows while the real threat slipped through its fingers. A sound reached him, then faint but distinct in the dead air. Metal on stone. Armor scraping. Another patrol, this one larger, heading directly toward a ravine, where he could just make out two small figures pressed flat against the rocks. Saitama moved. Not toward the hobbits, Gandalf's warning still echoed, but toward the patrol's path. He positioned himself on a ridge overlooking their route, picked up a boulder the size of a wagon, and hurled it. The stone arced through the smoky air, trailing ash, and crashed down 200 yards ahead of the patrol. The impact shook the ground, sent up a plume of dust and shattered rock. The orcs halted, chittering in their crude language, pointing toward the disturbance. Their commander, a hulking creature with mismatched armor and a cleaver blade strapped to its back, barked orders. The patrol changed course, moving to investigate what appeared to be a rock slide or enemy action. Away from the ravine. Away from Frodo and Sam. In the shadows below, Sam pulled Frodo to his feet. Come on, another 100 yards and we're past this section. They moved like ghosts, like the last whispers of breath from dying men, and the patrol never saw them. This pattern repeated through the day. Patrols diverted, watchtowers distracted by falling debris. A guard post evacuated when Saitama triggered a minor avalanche on a slope they'd been using as a vantage point. Each intervention was subtle, indirect. Never close enough to interfere with the hobbits directly, but sufficient to thin the net of eyes that should have caught them 100 times over. And with each action, the ring grew more confused, more withdrawn. It could sense the disruption, but couldn't locate its source. Couldn't tempt what it couldn't understand. Its whispers to Frodo grew fractionally quieter, its pull marginally weaker, as if some portion of its attention had been diverted to tracking this new unknown. In Barad-dûr, Sauron's frustration mounted. The anomaly persisted, evaded, defied every attempt to pin it down. And meanwhile, his grand army marched toward the Black Gate where Aragorn's pitiful force had assembled in open challenge. A challenge that should have been laughable. A few thousand men against hundreds of thousands. A gesture of defiance so futile it barely warranted notice. Yet the Dark Lord found his attention torn. The strategic pictures said to ignore the suicide march and focus on the true threat, the ring's location, the whispers from his servants about hobbit-shaped shadows in the eastern wastes. But the anomaly demanded investigation. This thing that his greatest weapon could not touch, could not corrupt, could not even properly perceive. Sauron made his choice. He would crush the fools at the Black Gate first, quickly, decisively. Then turn his full attention to hunting down this aberration and the ring's true bearers. It was the logical decision, the correct strategic move. It was also a mistake. By the time the eye fully refocused on the approaches to Mount Doom, Frodo and Sam had covered miles they should never have managed, had slipped through gaps that should have been impossible, had survived exposure that should have killed them 10 times over. The ring felt it happening, felt its bearer drawing closer to the one place in all of Middle-earth where it could be unmade. And for the first time in 3,000 years of patient scheming, it experienced something approaching panic. Saitama sat on a ridge overlooking the path to Sammath Naur, the cracks of doom, where the ring had been forged. He could see them now, 2 specks of movement in the vast emptiness, still miles from their goal, but closer than any enemy would believe possible. He picked up another stone, judged the distance to a watchtower whose garrison had begun to stir, drew back his arm, and hesitated. How much longer could he keep this up? How many more diversions before Sauron stopped chasing shadows and looked where it mattered? The strategy was sound. Draw the eye's attention away through confusion and misdirection. But strategies had expiration dates, and he could feel time running short. The thought of simply marching to Mount Doom himself, of carrying the hobbits, the final distance rose unbidden. It would be easy, so easy, over in minutes. But Gandalf's words returned. The journey mattered. The choice mattered. Take that away, and the ring found another path to victory. He released the stone. It tumbled down the slope, crashed into the watchtower's foundation, sent guards scrambling to investigate the apparent structural failure. The hobbits crawled on, unaware of the guardian they'd never asked for. Night fell over Mordor, though the distinction between day and night had long since lost meaning in that perpetual gloom. Fires burned on distant peaks. The forges of Orodruin, Mount Doom itself, glowed like a wound in the world. Frodo collapsed. Simply fell forward into the ash, his strength finally spent. Sam tried to lift him to urge him onward, but his own legs betrayed him. They lay there in the darkness, two small beings crushed under the weight of their purpose. The ring sensed its moment. Frodo's will, eroded by days of torture, wavered. The whispers grew loud again, insistent. Why continue? Why suffer? Just put it on. Just claim what was rightfully his, the power to end all this pain, to reshape the world into something better, something clean. And then the whispers stopped. Not because Frodo resisted, but because something moved in the darkness nearby. Something the ring recognized, even if its bearer did not. Saitama had come closer. Not directly to them, but close enough that his presence registered. Close enough that the ring felt that terrible void again, that absence of desire that made all its promises meaningless. The ring went silent, protective, withdrawn. In that silence, Frodo found his will again, found the strength to whisper to Sam, "Help me up. We're not finished yet." Sam pulled him to his feet. Neither hobbit saw the figure that withdrew back into the shadows, resuming his distant watch. But the ring knew, and it was afraid. Dawn approached, real dawn, this time the sun managing to pierce Mordor's pall for a few precious moments. In that gray light, Frodo and Sam could see Mount Doom properly for the first time. See the path that remained. See how close they'd come. Behind them, far to the west, the armies clashed at the Black Gate. Aragorn's desperate gambit, playing out exactly as Gandalf had predicted, a sacrifice to buy time to draw the eye away from what truly mattered. Saitama heard the distant thunder of that battle. Knew men were dying while he crouched in volcanic ash, guarding two hobbits who didn't know he existed. It should have felt wrong. Should have pulled at him to rush to the real fight to turn the tide with overwhelming force. But he stayed. Picked up another stone, eyed another patrol. Because this was the fight that mattered. Not the one with the most soldiers. Not the one with the most glory. This one. Two exhausted hobbits and a cursed ring crawling toward salvation, one agonizing step at a time. He hurled the stone. A guard tower erupted in chaos. The patrol diverted. And in the shadows of Mount Doom's eastern approach, Frodo and Sam crept forward unknowing and unaware, carrying the hope of the world on shoulders that should have broken long ago. The endgame had begun, and every second counted. The Black Gate stood like a monument to despair. Two towers of iron and stone flanking doors, tall enough to admit armies set into mountains that Sauron himself had raised through will and malice. Before these gates, on a plain of slag and ash, 7,000 men had assembled in formation. Against them a host beyond counting. Orcs in their tens of thousands, trolls men of the east, corrupted by promises of power and things older and fouler that had crawled from pits where light had never reached. It was not a battle. It was an execution waiting to happen. Aragorn sat his horse at the front of the formation, the reforged blade of Elendil gleaming in his hand. Behind him, the banners of Gondor and Rohan snapped in wind that tasted of endings. He had spoken his challenge, had demanded Sauron's surrender with words meant to carry conviction, even as his heart understood their futility. The gate had opened in response, not to parley, to show contempt. The orc army poured forth like a black tide, drums beating a rhythm older than kingdoms, voices raised in a shriek that promised only annihilation. "Hold!" Aragorn's voice cut through the rising chaos. "Hold until I give the word." The human lines tightened, spears leveled, archers drew. Every man there knew this ground would be his grave, knew the stories would record their names if anyone survived to tell stories at all. But they held. Because a king had asked it. Because sometimes defiance mattered more than survival. The armies collided with a sound like the world breaking. Saitama stood apart from the main formation, positioned on a ridge of volcanic rock where he could observe the full scope of carnage. He'd agreed to be here, to help. But as he surveyed the slaughter unfolding below, old doubts returned. He could end this, right now, in seconds. One serious strike at the gate itself would shatter. It collapsed. The towers create such chaos in the enemy ranks that the human army could withdraw before being completely overwhelmed. Or he could simply advance into the orc host, carving a path so devastating that their will broke entirely. Easy, simple, effective, and completely wrong, according to Gandalf's warnings. The wizard's voice echoed in his memory. There are entities older than Sauron. They wait for tears in the fabric. Saitama had never been good at restraint. His entire existence since breaking his limits had been defined by the freedom to act without consequence. Hit hard enough and problems dissolved. No complexity, no moral calculus, just force applied with precision. But here force was the problem. Power itself was the trap. Below the human lines buckled. Men fell, trolls crashed through shield walls. Orc cleavers rose and fell in rhythms of butchery that had no art, only efficiency. Saitama moved, not into the main press of battle, not toward the gate. He descended the ridge at an angle, targeting a flank where orc reinforcements were moving to encircle a Gondorian company that had become separated from the main formation. He didn't unleash the kind of devastation he'd shown at Pelennor. Didn't create shockwaves or clear entire swaths of battlefield. Instead, he simply removed obstacles. A troll turned to crush fleeing soldiers. Saitama appeared beside it, drove his fist into its knee. The creature toppled, crushing a dozen orcs beneath its falling bulk. He was already gone, reappearing 30 yards distant, where another cluster of enemies had begun to overwhelm a defensive position. Each intervention was minimal, precise. A punch that disabled rather than obliterated. A kick that sent enemies sprawling rather than disintegrating. He fought like someone defusing a bomb, careful, measured, aware that excessive force would detonate something worse than the immediate threat. It felt wrong. Every instinct screamed to just let loose, to stop holding back, to solve the problem the way he'd solved every problem before. But he didn't. From the center of the formation, Gandalf observed this restraint and understood its cost. The stranger could reshape the battlefield with a thought. Could probably march to Barad-dûr itself and tear down Sauron's fortress stone by stone. But he wasn't. He was fighting at a fraction of his capability, deliberately handicapping himself, trusting that the wizard's warnings held truth. That trust was about to be tested. From the black gate, a presence emerged that made the air itself grow cold. Not the Witch King, he was gone unmade. But something else. a lieutenant of Sauron whose name had been forgotten in the drowning of Numenor, who had served the Dark Lord since before the sun first rose. The Mouth of Sauron rode forth on a black horse, his form wrapped in ancient armor. His face, if face it could be called, hidden behind a helm that seemed to swallow light. He carried no weapon. Didn't need one. His presence alone was assault enough, a concentration of malice so pure it made mortal hearts stutter. He surveyed the battlefield with something like amusement, watching men die, watching the desperate defense crumble by degrees. Then his gaze found Saitama, found the anomaly that had plagued his master's attention for days. The mouth spoke, not in any language of men or elves, but in a tongue that predated both words, that carried weight beyond meaning, that pressed on the listener's mind like hands around a throat. Saitama felt it. Felt the will behind those words, trying to find purchase to grip his thoughts and twist them. But there was nothing to grip. No ambition to corrupt, no fear to exploit, no rage to kindle. Just emptiness where emotions should be. The mouth's certainty wavered. This should not be possible. Every creature in creation could be touched, influenced, broken by sufficient application of malevolent will. But this thing in the ridiculous yellow garment simply stood there unaffected, regarding the ancient evil with the same bored expression he'd worn since arriving. In Barad-dûr, the eye turned fully toward the Black Gate. Sauron had felt his lieutenant's confusion, had recognized finally what the anomaly represented. Not a warrior, not a power seeker, not anything that fit within the frameworks he understood. A void, an absence. A creature so far beyond the normal spectrum of existence that even the ring's temptation had no meaning for it. For the first time in ages, beyond counting, the Dark Lord felt something approaching uncertainty. This thing could not be corrupted, could not be controlled, could not be predicted using any of the tools Sauron had perfected over millennia of manipulation and dominion. Therefore, it had to be destroyed. The eye's full attention locked onto Saitama, not diverted, not partially focused, complete, total, absolute. And in that moment, in that instant, when Sauron's will concentrated entirely on eliminating the anomaly that defied categorization, his gaze shifted away from Mount Doom, miles to the east in the volcanic wasteland approaching Samath Naur. Frodo felt the pressure on his mind suddenly ease. The ring's whispers, which had grown to a deafening roar, fell to a murmur. The invisible weight crushing him lightened just enough to take another step. Then another. Sam noticed it too. "Mr. Frodo, something's changed." "I know." Frodo's voice carried a desperate hope. "We have to move, now, while we can." They scrambled forward, covering ground that minutes before would have been impossible. At the Black Gate, Saitama felt the eye's attention like a physical presence. It wasn't pushing at his mind. Sauron had already learned that was futile. Instead, it was directing force, marshaling power, preparing to eliminate this obstacle through sheer, overwhelming malice. Gandalf sensed it too, felt the gathering storm. "Get back," he shouted to the soldiers nearest Saitama. "Away from him. Now." The ground beneath Saitama began to crack. Not from anything he was doing, but from the weight of will being directed at him. The air shimmered. Reality itself seemed to strain under the pressure of Sauron's focused hatred. And Saitama understood finally what Gandalf had been warning about. He could feel it now, the edge of something vast. Not Sauron's power, but something behind it, beneath it, waiting in the spaces between existence. The entities the wizard had mentioned. The things that slept until the world tore enough to permit their entry. One serious punch right now, one full-force strike at the gate, or at Barad-dûr itself would shatter whatever barrier kept them at bay, would solve the immediate problem and unleash something infinitely worse. The red button, the final temptation, end the war, break the Dark Lord, shatter his armies and his tower and his malice in one overwhelming display of power. All it would cost was everything. Saitama stood in the center of that grinding pressure, feeling Sauron's will trying to crush him, feeling the whispers of ancient things promising that he could fight back, could unleash his full strength, could prove once and for all that nothing in this world or any other could stand against him. He exhaled slowly, relaxed his shoulders, and did nothing. The restraint felt like swallowing glass. Every instinct howled to respond, to push back, to demonstrate that threats meant nothing when you were strong enough. But he'd listened to Gandalf, had agreed to play by this world's rules, and sometimes the strongest thing you could do was stand still and endure. The pressure intensified. The ground beneath him began to liquefy from the concentration of malevolent will. Soldiers had fled the area entirely, now scrambling for distance from whatever was about to occur. Saitama's hands stayed in his pockets. In Barad-dûr, Sauron poured more power into the assault, more will, more concentrated hatred. This thing would break, would kneel, would acknowledge dominion or be unmade. It did neither. It simply stood there, utterly unmoved, enduring the full focus of the Dark Lord's attention, with the same bored patience it had shown when facing Gondorian gate guards. And slowly, reluctantly, Sauron understood. He couldn't win this way. Couldn't break what refused to acknowledge the attempt. Couldn't dominate what existed beyond domination. Every measure of power he directed at this anomaly was power not directed elsewhere, power not searching for the ring. The realization came too late. On the slopes of Mount Doom, Frodo Baggins crawled the final yards to the entrance of Sammath Naur. The fires of creation burned ahead. The path to ending 3,000 years of shadow lay open, and the eye locked in futile struggle with an opponent who could not be defeated because he refused to fight back, missed its chance to stop him. Sauron withdrew his attention from the Black Gate, turned it desperately back toward Mount Doom, screamed commands to his remaining servants. "Stop them! Stop them!" The ring approaches the fire. Too slow. All of it too slow. At the Black Gate, the pressure on Saitama ceased abruptly. The ground stopped buckling. The air cleared. Gandalf appeared beside him, staff planted in the cracked earth, his face drawn with exhaustion, but his eyes bright with desperate hope. "It's happening," the wizard said. "Right now. Frodo is at the fire." Did we buy enough time? We're about to find out. The Orc army, sensing their master's sudden distraction, faltered. The drums fell silent. Uncertainty rippled through ranks that had moments before been pressing forward in certain victory. Aragorn seized the moment. "Advance, in the name of the king. Drive them back." The human army surged forward, exploiting the confusion, buying seconds that might mean the difference between salvation and eternal darkness. And in Sammath Naur, in the fires where the ring had been forged, Frodo stood at the precipice with the chain dangling from his fingers, the golden band catching the light of creation. One choice remained. Destroy it, and Sauron falls. Claim it, and become something worse. The moment stretched, held, balanced on the edge of will and destiny, and the terrible freedom of choice. Saitama stood on the battlefield, unable to help. unable to interfere, trusting that the small and the brave could achieve what all his power could not. The answer came in fire and screaming, but that belonged to the next chapter of the tale. For now, in the space between heartbeats, the world waited to discover if hope or despair would claim the final word. The mountain breathed. It was not a living thing, yet it exhaled heat in long, uneven pulses, as if the land itself were reluctant to release what lay within. The path to Samath Naur wound upward through broken stone and rivers of old lava, their surfaces cracked like dried skin. Above it all loomed the cone of Mount Doom, its crown torn open, its heart exposed to the world in a constant glow that never dimmed. Frodo stumbled. Sam caught him before he could fall, one arm wrapped tight around his shoulders, the other braced against the ground. Frodo's body felt lighter than it should have, as if some essential weight had already begun to leave him, while another more terrible burden pressed down from within. "We're almost there," Sam said, though the word almost felt thin and fragile in his mouth. "Just a bit further." "You hear me?" Frodo nodded, but his eyes were unfocused. Sweat streaked his face, cutting pale lines through the ash that clung to his skin. Each breath rattled, drawn through a chest that no longer seemed to belong entirely to him. "I can feel it," Frodo said. His voice was low, strained, as though it had to pass through something sharp before reaching the air. "It knows. It knows where we are." Sam swallowed. "Then we don't stop. We don't give it time to think." They moved again, step by painful step. The world around them felt thinner here, stretched tight between fire and ruin. Even the silence carried weight, broken only by the distant churn of molten stone deep within the mountain. Far away, on a plain of ash and broken banners, Saitama stood motionless beneath a sky the color of old bruises. The black gate still loomed behind him, scarred and half-buried by the chaos of battle. Around him lay the signs of a war stalled at the edge of decision, bodies, unmoving weapons, abandoned soldiers crouched low as if the world itself might lash out again at any moment. The pressure had faded, but the aftertaste remained. Not pain exactly. More like the echo of something vast having leaned too close. He rolled his shoulders once slowly, as if loosening muscles after holding an awkward position for too long. That was annoying, he muttered. Gandalf stood a short distance away, staff planted firmly, his gaze fixed eastward. The wizard looked older now than he had days before, as if the act of holding the world together by counsel and caution had taken a visible toll. "You did well," Gandalf said without turning. Saitama glanced at him. "Didn't do much." "That is precisely what mattered." Saitama let out a quiet breath. "Feels weird standing around while everything's on the line." Gandalf nodded. "It is harder sometimes than action." Before Saitama could reply, a sudden tremor ran through the ground. Not violent enough to throw men from their feet, but strong enough to draw every eye toward the east. The air itself seemed to tighten, as if the world had inhaled and was waiting to see whether it would scream or sigh. In the depths of Mordor, something had shifted. Frodo stopped at the mouth of the chamber. Samath Naur yawned before them, a cavern carved by fire and malice, its walls slick with heat and shadow. At its center, a narrow ledge jutted out over a churning lake of molten stone. The glow rose in waves, painting everything in harsh orange and deep red, leaving no corner untouched. "This is it," Sam said softly. Frodo took a step forward, then another. Each movement felt deliberate, as if the world were watching to see whether he truly meant it. The chain around his neck felt heavier, with every breath the ring at its end, warm now, almost hot, as if eager. They reached the edge. The fire roared below, not loudly, but with a steady insistence that filled the mind as much as the ears. Frodo stared into it, his reflection broken and reshaped by the shifting light. For a moment the burden eased. Not vanished, never that, but loosened, just enough for another presence to slip in. You have come so far. The thought did not sound like a voice. It felt closer to memory, to something that had always been there and was only now reminding him of itself. All this suffering, all this loss. For what Frodo's hand tightened around the chain. To destroy you, he whispered. But the answer came smoothly, patiently. Or to end it. To finish the struggle. To make sure no one ever needs to crawl through ash again. Images pressed against his mind, the Shire green and untouched, roads without fear, faces no longer drawn tight by war. Power was not shown as conquest, but as relief. An ending. Sam saw Frodo hesitate. "Mr. Frodo," he said, alarm creeping into his voice. "Please, don't listen to it." Frodo turned slightly, just enough to look at him. There was something distant in his eyes now. Something shining that hadn't been there before. "I'm tired, Sam," he said. "I'm so tired." "I know," Sam replied, his voice breaking. "I know you are. But you're not alone. You never were." Frodo's fingers closed around the ring. "I can fix it," he said. "All of it." "No." Sam said sharper now, fear cutting through his usual gentleness. "That's not fixing. That's just another kind of ending." Frodo looked back at the fire. On the plain before the Black Gate, Saitama felt it. Not as pain, not as threat. More like a change in pressure, the way the air shifts before a storm finally breaks. He frowned slightly. "Something's happening," he said. Gandalf's grip tightened on his staff. "Yes." Saitama glanced east again, then back at Gandalf. "If this goes bad, you must not," Gandalf said at once. Saitama sighed. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." "It is not because I doubt your strength," Gandalf replied. "It is because some moments cannot be corrected, only witnessed." Saitama clicked his tongue softly, irritation flickering and fading just as quickly. "Hate those." Inside Sammath Naur, the world narrowed to a single point. Frodo lifted the ring. The fire surged, answering its presence with a violent brightness. The chain slipped through his fingers, hot enough to burn. "I will not do this thing," Frodo said. Sam's heart lurched. Mr. Frodo, I will not give it up." Frodo continued, his voice gaining strength, even as his body trembled. "I choose." The words faltered. For an instant, everything balanced on that pause. Then another presence entered the chamber. Gollum emerged from the shadows, like a torn thought given form. His eyes locked onto the ring with a hunger that drowned out everything else. He did not speak. He did not need to. He leapt. Sam shouted. Frodo turned. There was a flash of motion, a collision bodies striking stone. Frodo cried out as Gollum's teeth closed around his hand. Pain flared sharp and absolute. The ring came free with the severed fingers spinning through the air as Frodo fell backward. Gollum clutched his prize, laughing, staggering toward the edge. "Precious," he cried. "Mine, mine at last." Sam scrambled to Frodo's side, dragging him back from the brink. "Hold on. Stay with me." Frodo barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on Gollum, on the ring held aloft in trembling hands. Gollum danced unbalanced joy, making him careless. One step too far. The stone crumbled beneath his foot. His cry cut off as he fell, clutching the ring to his chest as both vanished into the fire below. The flames surged upward, swallowing them, and then the mountain roared, not in anger, but in release. A shock ran through the chamber, through the mountain, through the land itself. The fire flared white, then dimmed, as if something vital had been torn away. Frodo lay gasping on the stone pain and loss, and sudden lightness crashing over him all at once. Sam held him, tears streaking clean paths through the grime on his face. "It's gone," Sam whispered, scarcely daring to believe it. "It's gone." Frodo closed his eyes. On the plain of ash, the eye screamed. Saitama felt it not as sound, but as absence. The crushing attention that had once pressed against him shattered, scattering like smoke in a sudden wind. The air lightened. The sky seemed to crack light bleeding through places that had been dark for longer than memory. He blinked. "Well," he said quietly. "Guess that's that." Around him, orcs froze mid-motion. Some dropped their weapons. Others clutched their heads, howling as if something essential had been ripped out of them. Far to the east, a shape like a tower of shadow wavered, then collapsed inward, folding into nothingness with a soundless finality that still managed to feel loud. Gandalf exhaled a long breath he seemed to have been holding for days, perhaps years. His shoulders sagged just slightly. "It is finished," he said. Saitama watched the distant collapse expression unreadable. There was no surge of triumph, no sense of victory. Just an ending. "Good," he replied. The ground shook again this time with violence. Mount Doom convulsed its slopes, splitting open as rivers of fire burst free. Ash billowed into the sky, blotting out what little light remained. Inside the chamber, Sam hauled Frodo upright, slinging his arm over his shoulders. "We have to go," he said urgently. Now Frodo nodded weakly, every movement a struggle. Together they staggered toward the exit as the mountain began to tear itself apart behind them. Outside, the sky burned. Saitama felt the tremor roll across the land stronger than before. Heat washed over the plain in waves, carrying the scent of sulfur and ending. He glanced at Gandalf. "You sure I shouldn't?" Gandalf shook his head, already smiling despite the ash drifting down around them. "Not this time." Saitama let his shoulders drop. "All right." They stood together as the world changed. Far above, amid smoke and fire, two small figures clung to life on the edge of destruction, saved not by strength beyond measure, but by timing, chance, and a choice that no punch could ever replace. And for the first time since arriving in this broken land, Saitama felt something close to relief. Not satisfaction, not joy, just the quiet knowledge that he had not ruined it by trying to fix it too fast. The mountain roared on. The age ended in fire. And somewhere between restraint and ruin, the world found its way forward. The world did not end with a shout. It unraveled. Ash fell like tired snow over the plain before the black gate drifting down in slow, uncertain spirals. The sky, once bruised and heavy, began to pale at its edges as though light were cautiously testing whether it was welcome again. The earth still trembled beneath their feet, but the rhythm had changed. What had been violence became settling. What had been pressure became release. Men stood where they were, unsure what to do with survival. Aragorn lowered his sword. Around him, soldiers did the same, blades slipping from hands that had been clenched for too long. Some sank to their knees. Others stared eastward, mouths open, watching the distant ruin of Barad-dûr collapse into itself. Stone and shadow folding inward until nothing remained but a rising cloud and an absence where a threat had once dominated the horizon. "It's over," someone said. The words sounded strange, as if spoken in a language no one quite remembered how to use. Gandalf leaned heavily on his staff. His face was streaked with ash, his robes torn, but his eyes were clear in a way they had not been. since the war began. He looked not at the ruins, but at the men around him, at the living. "Yes," he said, "it is." Cheers did not come at once. There was no sudden roar of triumph, no immediate rush of celebration. Too many had fallen. Too much had been lost. Victory arrived quietly, almost shyly, as if unsure it deserved attention. Saitama stood a short distance away, hands in his pockets watching the reactions ripple outward. He felt lighter than he had in days, though the sensation was unfamiliar enough to make him suspicious of it. "So that's it," he said. Gandalf turned to him. "That is the end of one age," he replied. "The beginning of another." Saitama glanced back toward the east, where fire and smoke still clawed at the sky. "Doesn't feel like much of a beginning." "Beginnings rarely do," Gandalf said. "They are quiet things, fragile. It is what comes after that gives them weight." The ground shuddered again, more violently this time. A deep rumble rolled across the land as Mount Doom tore itself open, its fury no longer contained by the purpose it had served for so long. Rivers of flame cut new paths down its slopes, devouring stone, reshaping the land without malice or intent. Saitama watched it for a long moment. "Guess nature doesn't care about happy endings," he muttered. "No," Gandalf agreed. "It never has." Far from the plain amid smoke and falling fire, two small figures lay on scorched stone beneath a sky that seemed determined to burn itself empty. Frodo's breath came shallow and uneven. Each rise of his chest a quiet victory over pain and exhaustion. Sam knelt beside him, arms wrapped tight around his shoulders, refusing to let go, even as the world shook itself apart. "We did it," Sam said hoarsely. "Didn't we?" Frodo managed a faint nod. His gaze drifted upward, unfocused, as if trying to see past the smoke to something kinder. "It's gone," he whispered. "I can't feel it anymore." Sam laughed, then a broken, disbelieving sound that turned into a sob halfway through. "Thank goodness for that." The mountain answered with another roar, louder than before. Sam's head snapped up. "We need to move. Now!" They did not get far. The ground beneath them split, heat surging upward with a force that knocked them off their feet. Sam scrambled back to Frodo's side, pulling him close, shielding him as best he could from the searing air. "This isn't how it ends," Sam said fiercely, though fear clawed at his voice. "It can't be." High above them, something moved through the smoke, not with wings beating, but with a grace that cut through chaos, as though it were merely inconvenient. Saitama dropped from the sky and landed on the broken stone with a dull thud, knees bending slightly to absorb the impact. He straightened, already scanning the scene. "Wow," he said, taking in the collapsing mountain, the rivers of fire, the two hobbits staring at him in shock. "You guys really know how to pick vacation spots." Sam gaped. Frodo blinked slowly, as if unsure whether this was real or simply the mountain playing tricks on his mind. "Are we dead?" Sam asked. "Not yet," Saitama replied. He crouched, one arm sliding beneath Frodo's shoulders with a gentleness that seemed almost out of place. "And I'd like to keep it that way." "Your Sam began." "Long story," Saitama said. "Short version, time to leave." The ground convulsed again, more violently than before. Saitama rose, Frodo cradled against his chest, Sam clinging tight to his arm. "Hold on," he said. The world lurched. A moment later, they were gone. They reappeared on a rocky outcrop miles away, the air cooler, the sky clearer. Mount Doom still raged in the distance, but the worst of its fury was already spent, fire pouring outward in long, furious arcs that no longer threatened to swallow the world whole. Sam collapsed to his knees, laughing and crying in equal measure. Frodo sagged against Saitama's arm, eyes closing as his body finally surrendered to exhaustion. Saitama lowered him carefully to the ground. "There," he said. "End of the line." Sam looked up at him, face streaked with tears and ash. "You came back." "Yeah," Saitama replied. "Felt like the right time." "You didn't carry the ring," Sam said slowly, piecing things together. "You didn't interfere." Saitama scratched his head. "Wasn't my call." Sam studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you. For this." Saitama waved it off. "Don't mention it." When Saitama returned to the plain before the Black Gate, the fighting was over. Men moved among the fallen, now tending wounds, calling out names, searching for the living. The air smelled of smoke and blood and something else, relief perhaps, though it carried grief within it like a bitter aftertaste. Aragorn approached him, helm under one arm, his expression solemn but steady. "It is done," the king said. "Sauron is gone. His power is broken." Saitama nodded. "Good. You saved the ring-bearers," Aragorn continued. "Gandalf told me." "Barely," Saitama said. "They did the hard part." Aragorn studied him with a look that held no fear now, only curiosity, and a hint of something like respect. "You could have done more, at many points." "Yeah," Saitama replied. "I know. Why didn't you?" Saitama looked past him toward the land already beginning to change under a sky slowly reclaiming its blue. "Because this wasn't my story," he said. "I was just passing through." Aragorn inclined his head. "Then you have my thanks. And my people's?" Saitama shrugged, glad it worked out. In the days that followed, the world began the slow work of healing. The armies broke camp. The dead were honored. The living learned how to sleep without the constant expectation of violence. Minas Tirith filled with song and mourning, in equal measure banners raised not in triumph but in remembrance. Saitama stayed on the edges of it all. He watched Aragorn crowned beneath the white tree, now blooming again as if it had never known decay. He listened as Gandalf spoke with the ease of someone finally relieved of a burden he had carried for centuries. He saw Eowyn standing among her people, her gaze steady, her wounds bandaged, but her spirit unbowed. No one quite knew what to do with him. Some regarded him with awe, others with unease. A few tried to thank him, offering words food places at tables he never sat at for long. He declined them all politely. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the city in gold and shadow, Gandalf found him standing alone near the gates. "You will leave soon," the wizard said. It was not a question. Saitama nodded. "Yeah, feels like the right time. You could stay," Gandalf offered. "This world will need rebuilding, guidance, protection." Saitama smiled faintly. "You've got that covered." Gandalf returned the smile, small but genuine. "Perhaps. Still, your presence altered much." "Did it?" Saitama asked. "Seems like things ended the way they were supposed to." That Gandalf said softly, "Maybe your greatest achievement." Saitama considered that. "Huh." They stood in silence for a while, watching the light fade. "Will we meet again?" Gandalf asked at last. Saitama shrugged. "Hard to say. Worlds are big." "I tend to wander." Gandalf nodded. "If we do, I hope it will be under quieter skies." "Me too." When Saitama left, there was no fanfare. One moment he stood at the edge of the road, hands in his pockets, looking back at a land that had survived itself. The next he was gone, the air closing behind him, as though he had never been there at all. The age moved on. Stories were told, then retold, shaped by memory and distance. The ring-bearer's journey became legend. The king's return became history. Songs were sung of courage, of sacrifice, of small hands carrying burdens no army could lift. Of the bald man in the yellow suit, there were only whispers. Some said he was a spirit. Others claimed he was a trick of fate, a coincidence given form. A few insisted he was a hero who could have ended everything but chose not to. None of them were entirely wrong. Far away in a place between places, Saitama walked beneath a sky that did not burn hands in his pockets, expression thoughtful. For the first time in a long while, he did not feel bored. He did not feel fulfilled either, but he felt something close to satisfied. Not because he had won, not because he had proven anything, but because for once he had known when not to punch. And that somehow felt like progress.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future videos. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.